What would you do if 10 million liters of your drinking water disappeared each day, silently, without warning, beneath your own feet? Not because of drought, not because of nature, but because of a contract signed in secrecy by people who never asked your permission. Buried beneath the red sands of Burkina Faso lies a reservoir large enough to feed entire provinces. But for years it was siphoned off, pumped not for the people but for profit, not for survival but for lithium mines and foreign factories. No headlines, no outrage, just theft. And then one man stood up. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't draft a protest. He drafted a command, because the people can live poor, but they cannot live thirsty. And what he did next, without waiting for Western aid, without bowing to foreign threats, changed everything. Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It's the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe now, not for one video, but for a future where Africa no longer asks for permission. It didn't arrive with a siren. It didn't come through official memos or high-level alerts. It came in an envelope, creased, damp with sweat, delivered by hand to President Ibrahim Traoré himself. Inside, a single line printed in bold, "Your water is no longer yours." What followed was a dossier thick with satellite images, intercepted emails, bank statements, and blurry drone footage. But it wasn't the volume of data that silenced the room, it was what it meant. Every photograph showed the same betrayal. Pipelines snaking under red soil, armed convoys near remote pumping stations, foreign engineers operating under nightfall, and border crossings lit not by law, but by hired guns. The water was leaving. 4 million cubic meters. Every single month. That's enough to irrigate fields from Kaya to Gawa. Enough to keep every province hydrated through the dry season. Enough to be called what it truly was. Lifeblood. And it was being stolen. Silently. No press conferences. No community hearings. Just ink on a $600 million contract between a foreign corporation and a neighboring government. The reservoir, long understood to be a shared regional treasure, had become a private asset. Underground. Invisible. Guarded by mercenaries. Hidden from the very people who depended on it. Traoré stared at the war map. Not of troops or invasions, but of pipes. "If we lose our water," he said quietly, "we lose everything." This wasn't policy. This was survival. The intelligence chief slid forward a diagram, color-coded with red lines flowing south. "We estimate 4 million cubic meters redirected monthly," he said. "Primarily to fuel lithium extraction. Some gold. The rest is unclear." That's when Traoré asked the question that no leader should ever have to ask. How many people approve this? The room stayed silent. Officers looked down. No answers. Just signatures. Signed years ago, in hotel suites at backroom embassies, far from the sun-baked fields where women walked miles for a single bucket of water. The signatures of betrayal. They weren't just mining minerals. They were draining futures. And it wasn't only water. Satellite images showed heat-mapped military-grade installations. Guarded not by Burkina-based soldiers, but by 800 mercenaries. No flags on their uniforms. No national insignia. Just balaclavas and boots, armed with American rifles, French armored vehicles, and signal jammers designed to block satellite coverage within 2 kilometers. When Traoré asked about filtration, a young officer responded, "They built a purification system underground. It's fully remote. Once it's inside, it doesn't come back." That sentence, "it doesn't come back," hung in the air like smoke. 4 million cubic meters of water. Gone. Every month. Unpaid. Unannounced. Untouched by the people who needed it most. And when Burkina Faso tried to challenge it, when they raised objections through official channels, they were told such actions would be considered violations of trade agreements and sanctions would follow. So this wasn't just a pipe war. It was a sovereignty war. And as one officer whispered later that night, "They're not mining lithium. They're mining silence." This was the moment the world began to hear what the media never mentioned. The Captain Ibrahim latest news wasn't about rebellion. It was about reclamation. Because what is a flag worth if your rivers flow under someone else's contract? What is independence if your children bathe in dust? Theft can come with a gun or a pen. In this case, it came with both. And so, Traoré stood, not as a politician, but as a man at the edge of a well that no longer belonged to his people. He didn't need more evidence. He needed action. The next morning, there was no press briefing, no diplomatic delay, no vote in parliament. President Traoré walked straight into the national press chamber with a single sheet in his hand. No entourage, no teleprompter, just a signature and a number. $300 million. Today, he said, we launched the Green Lifeline campaign. We reclaim control, we restore dignity, and we protect our survival. There were no international consultants, no foreign donors. The funding came directly from the National Reconstruction Fund, a reserve built quietly, without IMF oversight, during years of whispered sacrifice. The mission? Clear. 5 new reservoirs, 200 deep-water wells. Nationwide water independence in 18 months. Begin today, Traore ordered, and within hours the ground moved. From Kaya to Ouahiguya, trucks rumbled across red earth. Military escorts guarded drilling rigs. Solar purifiers rolled through checkpoints. Engineers and builders didn't wait for directives. They arrived ready. Across 23 provinces, 200 men and women deployed. Combat engineers, volunteer militias, civil technicians. No one asked for rank. No one questioned shifts. They just worked. Maps were redrawn. Dry zones were prioritized. Colonial water routes, centuries old, were shut down and decommissioned. For the first time in its post-colonial history, Burkina Faso issued a national moratorium on all foreign-led water operations. Not a proposal, a decree. And then came the law. Traoré signed the Water Sovereignty Act, an emergency law mandating that every cross-border water extraction, transfer, or sale must be declared, logged, and reviewed by an independent sovereign commission. Any violation would trigger immediate revocation, blacklisting, and fines up to 5 times the declared transaction value. International law firms gasped. Foreign investors froze. But the streets of Ouagadougou erupted in cheers. Because what the world called radical, the people called long overdue. Still, the risks were real. A single misstep could trigger economic retaliation. Blocking the pipeline could invite military response. So why move forward? Because Traoré understood something no economist dared to admit. Without infrastructure, there is no independence. And without law, there is no justice. Meanwhile, at a military checkpoint in northern San Matenga, a volunteer commander radioed in. "Sir, first drill has struck. Water is clean." Traoré didn't respond over radio. He flew there. No helicopter convoy. No grand ceremony. He stepped off with rolled-up sleeves, a clipboard in one hand and a shovel in the other. His collar soaked with sweat. To the gathering crowd, he said only this. "This is not charity. This is repair for what they took and what they never paid for." And the people understood, because you cannot defend a people and let them die of thirst. You cannot claim sovereignty while your children walk miles for dirty water. This wasn't about engineering. It was about justice. And while the outside world debated feasibility, Traoré's team laid 2 kilometers of pipeline overnight. Communities built their own water councils, without instruction. Villages stationed young men as guards, not with rifles but with registers. This was no longer a project. It was a movement. And somewhere between the sweat of engineers and the prayers of mothers, something changed. Burkina Faso stopped asking and started building. At dawn, there were no speeches, no brass bands, no banners waving in the wind, just boots on dry soil and silence thick enough to slice through. 3 days had passed since the ultimatum was delivered. It was not sent through diplomats or embassies. It was sent by convoy, hand-delivered by the National Guard, sealed with the presidential crest. A single sentence: open the valves within 48 hours, or we will open them ourselves. No reply came, only movement. The border lit up with drone signals and dust. Mercenaries dug in deeper. Reinforcements arrived. Armored trucks repositioned. Thermal signatures doubled. It was no longer just about water. It was a standoff of sovereignty. "How many men now?" Traoré asked, standing over a live satellite feed. 900, replied the defense minister. "Most ex-military. Western gear. Communications encrypted. They're not preparing to negotiate." Traoré nodded once. "Good." He turned to his chief engineer. "How long to breach the control gate manually?" "Less than 3 minutes, the man replied. "If we get close, then we'll get close." That night, Burkina Faso went on high alert. 3 elite units activated under direct presidential command. They weren't infantry. They were hydrotechnicians, cyber specialists, geospatial analysts, trained not to destroy but to reclaim. Their name, Les Gardes de l'eau, the water guards. And as they moved, so did the people. Word spread, not through broadcasts, but through breath. In markets and mosques, in schools and wells, villagers gathered. Not to fight, but to witness. By the time Traoré arrived at the disputed pumping compound, no suit, no security detail, over 1,000 Burkina-Faso citizens stood behind him. Farmers, mothers, teachers, clerics, elders with walking sticks, children holding rusted jerry cans. Some carried flags, others carried silence. One simply held a plastic jug, cracked but clean. The foreign mercenaries stood 40 meters away, helmets on, no insignia, no eyes visible behind the mirrored goggles. Their fingers rested on triggers, trained not to think, just act. There was no signal, no drumbeat. Just a man in dust-stained boots, stepping forward with a sealed case in his hand. Inside, the override key. "Will he really do it?" whispered a foreign journalist embedded with the troops. Traore heard. He stopped, turned, and answered directly. "If Captain Ibrahim's latest news is that he came here and blinked, then I am no longer your president." He walked 20 meters, 15, 10. Still, the guns did not lower. Still, he did not stop. At the control station, he turned to the technician. "We in range?" The man nodded, trembling. "Yes, sir." "Then open it." The technician hesitated. "Sir, if we touch this, it could trigger perimeter response." "If we don't," Traore said, "we trigger collapse." The wrench turned. A vibration rumbled beneath the concrete. Pipes groaned. Then a hiss. Water. Clear. Cold. Defiant. It didn't roar. It didn't gush. It flowed, steady and purposeful, like a pulse returning to a body long silenced. The villagers erupted. Some screamed. Some wept. Others dropped to their knees. One woman lifted the first full jug to the sky, a silent offering to ancestors who'd long prayed for this moment. No bullets were fired. No one fell. And yet a battle was won. Traore turned to the camera crew, streaming live to every device in the nation. "This water," he said, "belongs to the people. It was taken without consent. It returns with honor." That image, Traore flanked by schoolteachers and shepherds standing firm between hired guns and a stolen pipeline, would echo across continents. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say Amen in the comments below. It began beneath a white canopy, simple, sunlit, surrounded by silence. No grand hall, no UN podium. Just 5 presidents seated shoulder to shoulder at a weathered table, the dust of the Sahel still clinging to their sleeves. In front of them, 70 pages of paper, thick with clauses, hand-inked signatures, and something no treaty had dared to declare before: water as sovereignty. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't speak first. He waited. When he did, his voice was quiet, but it traveled. Today, he said, "We do not sign a promise. We sign protection." And with that, the Sahel Water Treaty was born. Co-signed by Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, and Guinea, the agreement established a $2.4 billion sovereign fund, jointly governed by the 5 nations. Its mandate? To safeguard all transboundary water sources, to penalize unauthorized extraction, to develop regional equitable distribution systems that serve people, not pipelines. No consultants, no foreign boardrooms, just 5 African nations saying, "We will not ask permission to survive." International observers called it ambitious. Investors called it aggressive. But in the streets of Bobo Dioulasso, Bamako, and Niamey, it was called something else. Freedom. And the tremors traveled. Under Article 4 of the treaty, any foreign entity extracting water from member nations was required to submit full transparency reports, including satellite coordinates, contract signatories, and projected impact studies. Failure to comply? Immediate expulsion. Within 2 weeks, the impact was undeniable. 3 major foreign water firms, long operating in shadows, began pulling out. One Australian conglomerate issued a vague press release citing regional instability. Another, based in Europe, shut its Mali offices overnight. A third attempted to renegotiate and was denied at the door. President Traoré, addressing his economic council, was blunt. "They took our resources. Now they take their leave." But this wasn't just about eviction. It was about inversion. In Yatenga province, abandoned foreign pump stations were repurposed into community-led filtration hubs. In Kulpologo, solar water grids spread across zones once marked unviable. Old infrastructure, once guarded by rifles, now buzzed with village engineers and barefoot schoolchildren. Within 6 months, over 300 new water access points were operational. Not charity, not donation. Investment by Africans for Africans. And the results rippled. Agricultural output rose by 20%. Rice yields in the Co Valley doubled. Tomato cooperatives reported record-breaking harvests. Grain, once stored in emergency silos, now overflowed into surplus storage. It was not a boom. It was a return. In Jibo, families displaced by drought returned to find fresh irrigation. In Fagora, over 3,000 young people enrolled in the Green Lifeline employment scheme. Water was not just flowing, it was hiring. And yet, critics still circled. Unsustainable, they warned. Too reliant on political will. What if the fund dries up? What if the neighbors pull out? Traoré responded not in rebuttal but with resolve. If this fails, he said before a joint session of Parliament, then let it fail by our hands, not by theirs. Because failure rooted in courage is still more honest than survival shaped by fear. And in the cafes of Nairobi, the classrooms of Accra, the community halls of Harlem, another question began to stir. If water could be guarded, could minerals? Could forests? Could data? Could Africa finally set its own terms? The Burkina Faso latest news was no longer about conflict. It was about coordination. No longer about resistance, but redesign. Because when a continent that was once mapped for extraction begins to redraw its own boundaries, even the satellites take notice. In Kaya, they didn't celebrate with fireworks. They celebrated with water. Children danced barefoot around a freshly installed tap, splashing each other with clean, cold streams. Their laughter was not loud, but it echoed through the valley like thunder long withheld. For the first time in 18 months, water flowed freely. No checkpoints, no bribes, no shame. And just a few steps away, an old woman rinsed spinach leaves under the tap. When she saw President Traoré approaching, coat stained from road dust, she didn't bow. She smiled. "You came back," she said. "I never left," he replied. Because this was not a leader standing above the people. This was a son of the soil, returning water to its rightful keepers. Nearby, a village chief raised his voice, not in praise but in memory. "Those who control water," he said, quoting Traoré, "control life. And here life is not for sale." That sentence became more than a quote. It became a pledge. Graffiti artists in Dakar painted it across old dams. Students in Nairobi chanted it during campus protests. Elders in Harlem repeated it in community halls, where it struck like scripture. Because for too long, Africa's water had been extracted, not protected. Measured in contracts, not in lives. Bargained in boardrooms while babies drank dust. But now, the tide had shifted. At markets, water once rationed at 400 CFA per litre dropped to just 85. At schools, children no longer missed classes to walk miles with jerry cans. Grandmothers reopened gardens once abandoned to drought, now green with rain-fed hope. Malaria cases dropped by nearly 20%. Diarrhea infections fell by 38% in northern provinces. And for the first time since 2007, infant hydration rates reached WHO standards. This wasn't a policy win. It was a human one. And the people knew. In Gorum, communities formed night watches. Not to guard from theft, but to protect the pumps they had built with their own hands. In Far, a women-led engineering cooperative launched its own borehole scheme. Trained not by foreign NGOs, but by national instructors. And across the Sahel, young people stopped fleeing. Because the land was no longer dying. This was the reverse of exile. Water didn't just return crops. It returned people. It returned dignity. Still, skeptics murmured, what if the treaty crumbles? What if international courts intervene? But in the heart of the capital, Traoré stood before Parliament and spoke clearly. If it fails honestly. By our hands, not by theirs. But if it succeeds, then we write a future that no colonizer can erase. And in that moment, another question spread, like wind through wheat. If Burkina Faso could reclaim its water, what else could Africa reclaim? Its oil, its copper, its history, its children? Could sovereignty start not with soldiers but with wells? Could a continent, long defined by its export of resources, become a coalition of custodians, defending not pipelines but life? And perhaps the most radical question of all, could Africa birth an OPEC of water? A union not of profit but of purpose? Because the Captain Ibrahim latest news is no longer about protest. It's about blueprint. It's not about rebellion. It's about resurrection. So I ask you, would you stand for this vision? Would you believe in it? If you do, say Africa Rise in the comments below. Because the world may debate treaties in their studios, but in the villages of Kaya and the hills of Yatenga and the streets of Bobo Dioulasso, they'll remember one thing, the sound of water returning, like truth. Not through weapons, not through wars, but through wells. Burkina Faso didn't just dig for water, they dug for memory, for meaning, for a future where African children would no longer trace dry riverbeds with empty cups, but trace their lineage with pride. And as the Green Lifeline unfolded, from emergency drills to international treaties, it did more than irrigate land. It irrigated belief. Belief that we are not too late, not too poor, not too powerless. For decades, they called Africa a recipient, a beneficiary, a burden. But in the hands of President Traoré and the people who stood beside him, bucket in one hand, resolve in the other, Africa became something else. A restorer, a rebuilder, A reminder that self-determination is not radical. It's rightful. Because every drop reclaimed was more than water. It was a declaration. We are not asking. We are acting. No loans, no lectures, no permission slips signed in Western boardrooms. Just dust-covered hands signing dignity into law. Yet beyond the numbers and the maps, beyond the sanctions and the silence, this moment stands for something deeper. That sovereignty is not only found in borders or flags. It is found in a grandmother's garden, finally green again, in a child's clean hands, in the dignity of drinking without debt. So before we close, let us pause, not to celebrate a finish line, but to honor a beginning, a blueprint, a testimony that even in the driest soil, the seed of resistance can bloom. And if Burkina Faso could do it, then what, beloved, is stopping the rest of us? It didn't end with applause. It ended with silence, the kind that follows a truth finally spoken aloud. Because what happened in Burkina Faso was never just about water. It was about memory. It was about worth. It was about refusing to let the next generation inherit our silence. President Traoré didn't just open a valve. He opened a path where African nations no longer beg for basics but build with their own hands. A path where sovereignty isn't written in speeches, but in pipelines, in schools, in wells. He reminded us that dignity is not a donation. It is a decision. And as grandmothers plant spinach again, as children splash around solar-powered pumps, as farmers harvest enough to feed not just themselves but their neighbors, one truth becomes undeniable. Africa can do it. Burkina Faso's latest news is no longer a headline. It is a question whispered in every capital across the continent. What if we stopped asking? What if we stood up together? And so, to those watching across Brooklyn or Bamako, from South Chicago to Soweto, if this story moves something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Drop your thoughts below. Would you fight for water? Would you rise for justice? Would you believe in an Africa that owns its tomorrow? Let them debate their contracts. We'll remember the moment a nation turned its thirst into thunder. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear. Africa, rise.